My name is Galvin Finn. I'm 38 years old, a financial compliance consultant by profession, and at least until recently a husband who believed that quiet stability was enough to hold a marriage together. People usually describe me the same way: steady, reasonable, predictable. The kind of man who pays bills on time, remembers warranty deadlines, and reads contracts before signing them. The kind of man who doesn't raise his voice, who doesn't make scenes. And in many rooms, that kind of man becomes invisible, not because he lacks intelligence, not because he lacks strength, but because he doesn't compete for attention. In my marriage, that invisibility slowly became a role. I was the calm one, the reliable one, the man who would handle it. I took pride in that. I believed that love wasn't loud, it was structural. It was paperwork done properly. It was long-term planning. It was protecting what we built. What I didn't understand, at least not at first, was that silence can be misread. Calm can be mistaken for passivity, and trust can be tested quietly. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. There were no slammed doors, no broken plates, no police cars. It's about paperwork. It's about assumptions. And it's about a moment when my wife attempted something she believed I would never anticipate. She tried to transfer our house to her brother. Her surprise move failed because I'd already anticipated it. But that sentence, simple as it sounds, doesn't capture what really happened. It doesn't show the months of subtle dismissals. The small cut seemed harmless at first. The quiet realization that I had been assigned a role I never agreed to play. This story's about how I noticed, how I prepared, how I moved without noise, and what happens when someone underestimates the one person in the room who reads everything twice. If you're here expecting anger, you won't find it. If you're expecting bitterness, you won't hear it. What you will hear is clarity, because sometimes dominance isn't loud. Sometimes it's simply being ready before anyone realizes a move is coming. Have you ever been the quiet one in the room, the one people thought they understood completely in my wife's family? I was the stable one, not the charismatic one like her brother, Daniel, not the spontaneous one, not the risk-taker. I was the spreadsheet. It wasn't said cruelly. It was simply understood. At dinners in Seattle, when conversations drifted toward business ideas or investments, Daniel would lean back in his chair and talk big. Restaurants he wanted to open, property flips he almost closed, partnerships that just needed the right timing. Everyone listened. When I spoke, it was usually to clarify something practical, a zoning regulation, a financing structure, a tax implication. The table would go quiet. Not impressed, not offended, just quieter. Then someone would say, "Galvin always thinks about the fine print," followed by a polite smile, and the conversation would move back to Daniel's vision. At first, I took it as a compliment. Being the one who reads the fine print is not a weakness in my world. It's a responsibility. But over time, I began to notice a pattern. I wasn't the decision-maker in those conversations. I was the validator, the safety check, the man people consulted when they wanted confirmation, not when they wanted direction. In my marriage, it was subtler. My wife, Claire, used to call me her anchor. She said I made her feel safe. That with me, life felt solid. I wore that word like a badge of honor, anchor. But anchors don't move. Anchors hold things in place while others sail. When we bought our house, 3 bedrooms, craftsman style, just north of Green Lake, it was technically a joint decision. But the research, the negotiations, the structural inspection reviews, the title review, that was all me. Claire would joke to her friends, "I just show up and sign where Galvin tells me." They laughed. I smiled, because it was mostly true. What no one saw was that I never told her where to sign. I explained. I walked through every clause. I asked if she understood. I asked if she was comfortable. She would wave her hand lightly and say, "Babe, I trust you." Trust is a powerful word, but trust without engagement creates imbalance. I didn't notice it then. Or maybe I did and convinced myself it didn't matter. I handled our finances. I structured our joint accounts carefully. I tracked mortgage payments. I reviewed property tax assessments annually. I made sure our homeowners' insurance covered edge cases most people never consider. To them, I was cautious, predictable, almost boring. To me, I was protecting our future. The shift didn't begin with shouting. It didn't begin with betrayal. It began with the assumption that I would always be the same, that I would always remain calm, that I would never question, that I would never anticipate a move made without me. And once people believe you are predictable, they begin to plan around you. I didn't yet realize I was being planned around, but I was starting to feel something subtle. Not anger, not suspicion, just a quiet awareness that I was being treated less like a partner and more like infrastructure. And infrastructure isn't consulted, it's used. The first time I felt it, it was almost laughably minor. Claire and I were sitting at our kitchen island on a Thursday evening. The rain tapped softly against the windows, the steady, familiar rhythm of a Seattle winter. She had her laptop open, angled slightly away from me. Daniel's name flashed across her screen in a text notification. She smiled, not unusually, not secretively, just warmly. Daniel thinks he found a good opportunity, she said casually, not looking up. There's a small duplex near Tacoma. Needs work, but he says it could flip fast. I nodded. What's the purchase price? She hesitated half a second. Not sure yet. He's still gathering details. That wasn't strange. What was strange came next. He asked if we'd be interested in helping him get it off the ground. She added, just temporarily. Just temporarily. I set my coffee down. Helping how? Well, she said, still typing. Maybe leveraging some of our equity, just to secure financing. It wouldn't be permanent. There it was. Small. Casual. Almost harmless. But something in my chest tightened. Has he run the numbers? I asked. She finally looked at me. Galvin. It's just an idea. You don't have to go into audit mode. Audit mode? She laughed lightly when she said it. It was charming. Like it was predictable. And I smiled back. Because that's what I did. But in that moment, something registered. She had already discussed leveraging our home equity with her brother before mentioning it to me. The house, our house, the one I had negotiated carefully, the one whose title I had reviewed line by line, the one whose ownership structure I had insisted remain clean and protected. And somehow, a conversation about using it as collateral had happened without me. It wasn't the idea that unsettled me. Investments can be evaluated. Risks can be calculated. It was the order of operations. Decision energy first. Consultation second. I asked calmly. When did you two talk about this? Oh, just this week, she said quickly. It's not serious. Don't make it serious. Don't make it serious. Another small phrase. Another quiet cut. I didn't push. Instead, I asked for the listing details. She said Daniel would send them if we decide to explore it. If we decide, but the language felt off. The current was already moving in a direction I hadn't stepped into. That night, after Claire went to bed, I sat at my desk with my black leather portfolio open. I wasn't investigating her. I was reviewing the structure, our deed, our mortgage terms, our equity position. Not because I distrusted her, because I sensed something subtle, a boundary had been tested casually. The next morning, Daniel called me directly. Hey man, he said cheerfully. Claire mentioned you might have questions about the duplex. Might. I listened as he described projected returns that felt optimistic at best. Assumptions stacked on assumptions. Renovation costs were underestimated. Market timing is treated like certainty. When I asked specific questions, he laughed softly. You're always thorough, he said. That's why this works. I bring the vision. You bring the caution. There it was again. Vision and caution. Creation and limitation. Hero and brake pedal. I thanked him for the information and told him I'd review it. When I hung up, I didn't feel angry. I felt categorized. That night, Claire said gently, I don't want you to shoot this down automatically. Daniel just needs support for once. Support, not a partnership, not evaluation. Support. I realized then that in their narrative, my role was already defined. I was either the obstacle or the resource. There was no third option. And that was the first small cut. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet realization that my voice was expected to either approve or stay out of the way. I didn't raise mine, but I began listening more carefully. After the duplex conversation faded, something else began to take its place. Not another request, not another proposal, just a pattern. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining it. Claire started looping Daniel into conversations that used to belong to just the two of us. Renovation ideas, vacation plans, even discussions about refinancing options when interest rates shifted. It was subtle, almost procedural. We would sit at dinner, and she would say, "Daniel thinks we should wait before locking anything in," as though his opinion naturally occupied equal space. I would ask, "Did he look at our numbers?" And she'd reply, "He doesn't need to. He has good instincts." Instincts. I deal in documentation. Instincts don't show up in contracts. But I let it pass, because every time I felt the urge to press further, another thought intervened. You're overreacting. Families talk. Brothers give advice. It's normal. That's how normalization works. It disguises itself as reason. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. Claire was at the dining table with a folder open, not one of mine. I know my paperwork by sight. Daniel was sitting across from her. They both looked up when I walked in. "Oh. Hey," Claire said quickly. "We were just going over something." "Just something?" Daniel echoed with a grin. I set my briefcase down slowly. "What are we reviewing?" Claire flipped the folder closed. Not abruptly, but intentionally. Just options. Nothing finalized. Options. I noticed she didn't hand the folder to me. She didn't offer. I had to ask, "Can I see?" There was a pause. Not long. Just long enough to register. Daniel leaned back. "It's preliminary stuff. We didn't want to waste your time until it was clearer." "Waste my time!" I nodded, calmly, but something inside me shifted slightly. Because clarity is my domain, ambiguity is where mistakes grow. I sat down anyway. "Walk me through it." Claire did, though her tone carried a faint defensiveness. It was another financing structure idea. More leverage. More risk is layered onto optimism, and as she spoke, I realized something unsettling. They weren't excluding me because they thought I was incapable. They were excluding me because they thought I was predictable. They believed they already knew my answer. And instead of challenging that belief, I had reinforced it for years. Every time I responded calmly. Every time I dissected risk without emotion. Every time I declined an idea without visible frustration. I had trained them to see me as safe. And safe people are rarely feared. Over the next few weeks, the language became more casual. "You wouldn't like this approach. You'll probably say it's too risky. Let's not bring Galvin into it yet." They said these things in front of me sometimes, half joking, half true, and I laughed lightly when they did. Because raising an objection would confirm their caricature, so I did what I have always done best. I observed. I started noticing how often Claire framed decisions with Daniel first. How often she presented me with conclusions rather than conversations. It wasn't loud disrespect. It was a procedural dismissal. The assumption that my role was technical, not strategic. Helpful, not central. Reliable, not decisive. One night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed a phrase she had used earlier. "You don't need to worry about it." Need, as though my involvement was optional, as though my stake was secondary. I didn't confront her, not yet, because something inside me understood a truth I hadn't fully articulated. When people underestimate you consistently, arguing doesn't fix it. Clarity does, and clarity requires patience. So I stayed quiet, but my silence was no longer automatic. It was becoming deliberate. There's a moment when you stop asking whether something is happening and start recognizing the pattern for what it is. For me, that moment didn't come with an argument. It came with a seating arrangement. We were at Claire's parents' house for Sunday dinner. The table was long, oak, slightly worn at the edges from decades of use. Daniel sat at the head, animated as always, describing a new collaborative opportunity he was exploring. Claire sat beside him. I was placed midway down the table, between her cousin and her mother. It sounds insignificant, but placement is symbolic. Daniel gestured toward Claire. "She and I have been mapping out the next step. There's real upside here." She nodded, leaning in toward him slightly. "We just need to structure it right." Structure it right. That used to be my language. Her father turned to me. "Galvin, you'll make sure the paperwork's clean, I assume. Not what do you think, not is this wise. Just you'll make sure it's clean." I smiled. "If it's viable." Daniel waved a hand dismissively. "It will be. We're not rushing." But he didn't look at me when he said it. I realized then that my presence at that table had been mentally categorized. Daniel was visionary. Claire was aligned. I was compliant. Reliable. Useful. Invisible. After dinner, Claire and I drove home in near silence. The city lights reflected faintly off the windshield. I kept my hands steady on the wheel. "You were quiet tonight," she said finally. I was listening. "To what? To the rolls, I replied calmly. She frowned slightly. What does that mean? I chose my words carefully. It means everyone seems clear on what I'm supposed to handle. She gave a soft laugh. You're good at what you do, Galvin. That's not a bad thing. No, it wasn't. But something had crystallized. I wasn't being excluded by accident. I was being positioned. The steady husband. The safe executor. The man who would absorb risk after others decided it was worth taking. And perhaps the most revealing part, no one asked whether I agreed with the direction anymore. They assumed my job was to optimize it after the fact. That night, I sat at my desk again. The black leather portfolio lay open in front of me. Though I wasn't reading anything, I was thinking about ownership, about authority, about perception. In finance, there's a concept called control without title. It describes situations where someone appears influential but has no formal power. I wondered, quietly, whether I had become the opposite, title without perceived control. Our home was jointly owned. Our accounts were structured carefully. Our future plans had been built with precision. On paper, I was not secondary, but socially, emotionally, I had allowed myself to be framed that way. Not because I was weak, because I valued peace. But peace without boundaries slowly becomes eroded. And erosion doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly, grain by grain. I didn't feel anger that night. I felt something colder, recognition. I had been assigned a role, and I had played it flawlessly. The question was no longer whether they underestimated me. The question was whether I intended to remain predictable. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider something different. Not confrontation, not escalation, just recalibration. Because if people believe you are infrastructure, they stop checking the foundation. And foundations, when adjusted silently, can change everything built above them. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, in my office, under fluorescent lighting that hummed faintly above my desk. I was reviewing a client file routine compliance work. Nothing dramatic when my phone buzzed with a notification from our bank. Unusual activity alert, not a large withdrawal, not fraud. Just a credit inquiry tied to our property address. I stared at the screen for a long second. Credit inquiries don't appear randomly. They follow conversations, applications, exploratory steps. I opened the details. It wasn't finalized, just a soft pull enough to evaluate lending eligibility using our home's equity profile. Our home. No signature required for an inquiry. No confrontation triggered. Just interest? I didn't call Claire immediately. I didn't accuse. I didn't even feel betrayed in that instant. What I felt was clarity. The conversations with Daniel. The options folder. The increasing normalization of decisions happening before I was consulted. This wasn't hypothetical anymore. Movement had begun. I closed my office door not dramatically, just gently, and sat back in my chair. For years, I had believed that being transparent and cooperative would naturally ensure mutual respect. That good structure and good faith would be enough. But structure without boundaries invites testing. And testing, if unaddressed, becomes an assumption. I pulled up our property records through the county portal, title status, ownership classification, mortgage lien details. Everything was still intact. But I reviewed it differently now, not as a caretaker, as a strategist. There's a quiet difference between reacting and anticipating. Reacting waits for confirmation. Anticipating reads trajectory. I didn't assume Claire was trying to deceive me maliciously. I didn't create a villain in my mind. Instead, I asked a calmer question. If I were in her position, believing my husband predictable, what would I attempt next? Would I wait for permission? Or would I move forward assuming I could smooth it over later? That thought didn't hurt. It clarified. Because predictability is not safety. It's leverage for the other side. And I had allowed myself to be completely legible. Every preference, every threshold, every likely response. I had been transparent to the point of being readable. That afternoon, I made no calls. I sent no messages. I simply began adjusting. First, I contacted a title attorney I'd worked with professionally years ago. Not to file anything dramatic, just to schedule a consultation about ownership protections and notification triggers. Then I reviewed the specific clauses in our mortgage agreement about encumbrances and equity leverage. Then I did something I had not done in a long time. I stopped assuming alignment, not emotionally, structurally. That was the shift. I wasn't angry at Claire. I wasn't afraid of Daniel. I wasn't panicking about losing anything. I was recalculating. Because once you realize someone believes you won't move, The most powerful thing you can do is move quietly first. That evening, when I came home, Claire greeted me with the same warmth she always had. Nothing seemed different, and maybe, from her perspective, nothing was, but from mine. The ground had tilted. Not dramatically, just enough. I kissed her on the cheek, asked about her day, listened, and beneath the surface of normalcy, a decision had already begun forming. Silence was no longer the default. It was becoming a strategy. After that Tuesday, I stopped reacting. Not externally, internally. There's a difference. Outwardly, nothing changed. I still left for work at 7:30, still reviewed the mail, still asked Claire how her day went, still listened when Daniel's name entered the conversation. But inside, I was no longer absorbing information passively. I was categorizing it. The next time Claire mentioned Daniel's timeline for his investment idea, I didn't ask follow-up questions. I didn't critique assumptions. I didn't offer alternative projections. I simply said, "Let me know when you need anything from me." She blinked slightly at that. No analysis, no resistance, no audit mode, just openness. And that openness unsettled her more than objection ever had. Over the following week, I noticed subtle shifts in her tone. She seemed to probe for my stance indirectly. "You're quiet about all this lately. I trust you to make good decisions," I replied evenly. It was true technically. Trust doesn't mean unawareness. It means you're watching without flinching. Daniel, on the other hand, grew more animated. He began speaking as though momentum had already been secured. "I think we're close to locking something in," he told me over coffee one afternoon. "Just ironing out structure." I nodded. "Structure is important." He smiled, perhaps interpreting my lack of challenge as agreement. Silence is often misread as surrender, especially by people who equate noise with power. At work, I accelerated my consultation with the title attorney. Not urgently, not emotionally. Methodically, I asked precise questions. What notifications are triggered if a co-owner attempts to alter the title? What documentation is required for equity-based encumbrances? What structural safeguards can prevent unilateral action without creating marital friction? The attorney answered calmly, professionally. There were mechanisms available. Protective layers that didn't require confrontation, just foresight. I implemented them, not dramatically, quietly. Back at home, Claire seemed lighter, less defensive, as though my reduced questioning signaled compliance. One evening, she said, almost teasingly, "See, you're not shooting everything down." "I'm not opposed to good ideas," I said, and that was true. But good ideas survive scrutiny. Weak ones prefer speed. I began observing something else. Without my resistance, Daniel's confidence increased. His assumptions grew bolder. He started speaking about timelines in weeks instead of months. That told me everything I needed to know. They believed the only barrier had been my caution. Remove the caution, and the path clears. What they didn't realize was that caution had never been the barrier. Control was, and control doesn't announce itself. It documents itself. One night, I stood in the hallway outside our bedroom and listened faintly to Claire's voice as she spoke on the phone with Daniel. "He's not pushing back anymore," she said softly. "I think he's finally coming around." There was no malice in her tone, just relief. Relief that the obstacle had softened. I didn't step into the room. I didn't interrupt. I simply absorbed the confirmation. In their narrative, my silence equaled surrender. In reality, my silence had become informed. And informed silence is dangerous not because it seeks harm, but because it prepares without announcing. The more they relaxed, the clearer the trajectory became. Something was being set in motion, and for the first time, I wasn't waiting to respond to it. I was already ahead of it. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. That's what made it effective. Over the next month, while Claire and Daniel spoke in increasingly confident tones about timelines and alignment, I focused on documentation. Not because I expected war, because I expected movement. The first thing I did was conduct a complete personal audit not of our finances, but of authority. Who could sign what? Who could request what? What notifications were triggered automatically? And which ones required proactive registration? Most couples don't examine those questions until something goes wrong. I examined them before anything visibly did. Through the title attorney, I quietly added enhanced notification safeguards to the property record legal, standard, and entirely appropriate for jointly held assets. Any attempt to modify, encumber, or transfer interest would now require verified dual consent with immediate direct notification. Not just to a shared email. To me, specifically. No announcement required. No confrontation needed. Then I did something even quieter. I requested a certified copy of the original deed and mortgage agreement and stored them digitally encrypted and physically archived in my black leather portfolio. Not because I feared losing them. Because leverage begins with clarity. Meanwhile, Claire's tone shifted subtly at home. She was lighter, more affectionate even, as though the removal of tension between us validated her path. One evening, she said casually, "I'm glad you're not overthinking everything lately." "I still think," I replied gently. She smiled, missing the distinction. Daniel, on the other hand, began moving faster. He called less to consult and more to inform. "We're close," he said one afternoon. "Just paperwork alignment now." Paperwork. The word lingered. I asked calmly, "Alignment with whom?" "Just internal structure," he replied quickly. "Nothing finalized yet. Internal structure without my involvement." That confirmed what I had already suspected. Conversations had progressed beyond brainstorming. But instead of pressing, I leaned back. "Let me know if you need my signature on anything," I said. There was a pause on the line. "Of course," he answered, but his tone carried something new. Expectation. He believed I would sign, because I always sign when the math is clean. What he didn't understand was that math includes probability, and probability includes human behavior. At work, I spent late evenings reviewing case studies of property disputes not for drama, but for patterns. How do most title conflicts arise? Where do assumptions create vulnerability? The answer was almost always the same: speed and familiarity. When people assume cooperation, they cut procedural corners, so I adjusted one more layer. I placed a voluntary restriction notice on the title requiring in-person notarized verification for any transfer request. Subtle, legal, protective. No spouse needs to be notified to do that. It's framed as security, which it was. At home, life remained outwardly calm. We had dinner. We watched television. We attended social gatherings. No raised voices. No accusations. But inside, I felt a growing stillness, not tension. Readiness. Because here's what they never noticed. I stopped asking for information. I let it come to me. And when you stop chasing details, people reveal their intentions through acceleration. One afternoon, Claire came home with an unusual brightness in her voice. "Daniel thinks we're almost ready," she said, setting her purse down. "Almost ready." For what I asked evenly. She hesitated a fraction too long. "For the next step," I nodded once. "Good," I said. "Clarity is important." She studied my face, perhaps searching for resistance. There was none, only calm. What she couldn't see was that every step she believed was moving forward had already been anticipated. Every possible angle, every possible assumption, and the house, the one they saw as leverage, it was no longer as accessible as they believed. Not because I fought, but because I prepared, quietly. The private reveal didn't come from Claire. It came from a courier envelope. Mid-morning. Thursday. Discreet packaging. My name typed cleanly across the front. Inside was a formal request for documentation sent from a regional lending office. Not approval paperwork. Not finalized contracts. A verification inquiry, specifically referencing a proposed restructuring of property interest pending spousal consent. Pending. I read the phrase twice, not because I was shocked, because I wanted to understand the sequence. They had progressed far enough to initiate formal lender engagement. That meant numbers had been submitted, projections provided, intent communicated. Without my signature, without my awareness at least. That's what they believed. I didn't call Claire. I didn't call Daniel. I called the lender. Calmly, I identified myself as a co-title holder and asked for clarification regarding the inquiry. The representative was polite and procedural. "Yes, sir. We received preliminary documentation regarding a proposed partial interest transfer to facilitate financing." Partial interest transfer. There it was. Clean language. No emotion. Just structure. "Who submitted it?" I asked. "There appears to be a draft agreement listing your spouse as the primary applicant, with an intended transfer of equity interest to a third party." "Third party?" "Daniel." The representative paused. "We are currently awaiting full title verification and dual consent before proceeding." Dual consent. That was the quiet protection I had already reinforced. "Understood," I replied. "Please note that no consent has been granted." The representative made a notation immediately, and in that moment, the entire situation clarified. Claire hadn't necessarily planned a dramatic betrayal. She had assumed cooperation. assumed that when presented with finalized paperwork, I would evaluate, sigh slightly, and sign because the structure would be clean enough. She believed the surprise would be persuasive. What she didn't know was that I had already closed the path she intended to use, not by confrontation, by anticipation. That evening, I sat alone in my office at home with the documents spread neatly across my desk. There was no adrenaline, no anger, just confirmation. The house wasn't just a property, it was stability, it was leverage, it was long-term protection, and someone had attempted to convert it into a short-term opportunity without fully involving me. The irony wasn't lost on me. They believed I had stopped paying attention. In reality, I had shifted from participant to observer, and observers see more. I didn't confront her that night. Instead, I asked a simple question over dinner. How far along is Daniel's plan? Claire hesitated slightly. It's progressing. Progressing how? Just paperwork stages. Paperwork stages. I held her gaze calmly. And when were you planning to include me in those stages? Her fork paused mid-air. It's not like that, she said quickly. We were just getting clarity first. Clarity. I almost smiled at the word. Good, I replied. Clarity is essential before anyone signs anything. Her eyes flickered. Not fear, uncertainty. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure what I knew. And that uncertainty, that was the reveal. Not explosive, not loud, just a subtle shift in gravity. They thought they were ahead, but the title had already been secured. The safeguards were already in place, and the path they were counting on. It required something they did not have. My consent. Once you realize you hold the leverage, the real test isn't whether you can use it. It's how, after the lender's confirmation, I had options. I could confront Claire, immediately lay the documents on the table, ask direct questions, force clarity through pressure. I could contact Daniel and state plainly that the proposal would not proceed. I could even escalate legally, creating distance and formal boundaries overnight. All of those were available. None of them aligned with my code. I don't act in anger. I don't move without understanding consequences. And I don't confuse reaction with strategy. The truth was simple. The transfer attempt would fail automatically without my consent. The protective measures I'd put in place ensured that, so the house was safe. But the marriage, that was the variable. This wasn't just about property anymore. It was about perception. Claire believed she could move forward structurally and manage me later emotionally. That assumption had to be addressed, but not with accusation. With clarity. I spent 2 days thinking not about how to block the move, but about what outcome I actually wanted. Did I want to punish? No. Did I want to embarrass Daniel? No. Did I want to preserve the marriage at any cost? Also, no. What I wanted was alignment or, at the very least, honesty. And honesty cannot grow in an environment where one person believes the other is predictable and compliant. So I made a choice, not to explode, not to threaten, but to let the process reach its natural wall. I would not intervene early. I would not warn them. I would allow the lender to require full consent and verification. I would allow the structural safeguards to surface organically. Because when a plan fails due to external structure, the conversation shifts from "you stopped us" to "why didn't this work?" And that difference matters. I also made a secondary decision, quieter, but more significant. I scheduled a meeting with a family law attorney, not to file anything, to understand my position. Information is not aggression. It's preparation. I needed to know what separation would look like, how assets would be evaluated, what exposure existed. The attorney walked me through it clinically. Joint assets, equity distribution, marital timelines. I asked precise questions, took careful notes. Then I closed the folder and thanked her. I didn't feel like a man preparing for divorce. I felt like a man ensuring he was never cornered. That weekend, Claire was unusually affectionate, attentive, as though something was about to be presented. I let the days pass calmly. On Monday afternoon, she texted, "Can we talk tonight? Daniel's coming over." There it was, the presentation stage, the moment they likely believed would secure everything. I read the message twice. Then I responded with one word: of course. Because sometimes the most irreversible decision isn't blocking someone's move, it's choosing not to interrupt it. And I had decided they would reveal everything themselves. Monday evening arrived without tension. That was intentional. I left work at my usual time, stopped for groceries, sent Claire a normal message asking if we needed anything extra for dinner. Routine disarmed suspicion. When I walked into the house, Daniel was already there. Jacket off, sleeves rolled. Papers are neatly stacked on the dining table. Claire looked composed but alert. Not nervous. Prepared, I greeted them both calmly, set the groceries down, and joined them at the table. Daniel slid a folder toward me. Okay, he said with practiced enthusiasm. We've structured it cleanly. Low exposure, high upside. We just need to formalize equity participation so the lender can finalize terms. Formalize equity participation. Translation transfer partial interest. I opened the folder slowly. Inside were draft agreements outlining a temporary equity reassignment from Claire to Daniel, positioned as strategic leverage to unlock financing for his investment. Temporary. Conditional. Optimized. They had learned the language. I read every line without rushing. No one spoke while I did. The silence wasn't uncomfortable for me. It was heavy for them. After several minutes, I closed the folder gently. Who drafted this, I asked. Daniel answered quickly. A consultant I know. He's done similar structures before. Has a title attorney reviewed it, I asked. A brief pause. It's standard, Daniel replied. Nothing unusual. Standard is not the same as secure. I folded my hands on the table. There's a problem, I said evenly. Claire stiffened slightly. Daniel leaned forward. What problem, he asked. I met his eyes calmly. The title cannot be modified without dual verified consent and in-person notarized confirmation. The lender is aware of this. Claire's expression changed first. Not anger. Confusion. What do you mean, she asked. I continued, steady and neutral, that the property has protective restrictions in place. Any transfer attempt triggers direct verification requirements. I was notified last week. The room went quiet. Daniel blinked. You were notified? Yes. Claire turned toward me slowly. You knew. I anticipated movement. I replied. There was no accusation in my voice. Only fact. Daniel's confidence thinned. Why would you put restrictions on the title without discussing it? I didn't restrict ownership, I said calmly. I reinforced consent requirements. That's responsible asset management. Claire stared at the papers in front of her as though they had changed shape. This was supposed to be collaborative, she said quietly. It still can be, I replied. But collaboration requires inclusion before submission. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures, just gravity settling into the room. Daniel leaned back, recalculating. So what are you saying? I'm saying, I answered, that no equity will be transferred. Clear, final, not angry, not negotiable. The folder remained closed between us. For the first time since this began, they understood something fundamental. I had never been out of the loop. I had been ahead of it, and everything they believed was nearly complete. Had never been structurally possible, not without me. The meeting ended without shouting. Daniel gathered his papers more slowly than he had laid them out. Claire walked him to the door. Their voices were low, measured. I stayed at the table, not victorious, not shaken, just present. When Claire returned, she didn't sit immediately. She stood near the counter, arms lightly folded, not defensive, just uncertain. You should have told me, she said quietly. Told you what I asked, that you put restrictions in place. I reinforced consent requirements. I replied, because I noticed momentum. She exhaled slowly. You assumed the worst. No, I said, I assumed movement without alignment. That difference mattered to me. To her, maybe less. Over the next few days, the consequences didn't explode outward. They unfolded subtly. Daniel stopped calling, not abruptly. Just silence where there used to be enthusiasm. Claire became quieter at dinner, less animated when discussing future plans. There was no accusation, no direct conflict, but something had shifted. The narrative they had built where I was predictable and manageable had cracked, and uncertainty makes people uneasy. On Thursday afternoon, Claire approached me in my office at home. Daniel says the lender pulled back. She said, I know. I replied, you know, yes. She studied me carefully. Are you proud of this? She asked. It wasn't hostile. It was searching. No, I answered honestly. I'm aware of it. There's a difference between pride and clarity. She sat down across from me. He feels blindsided. I wasn't hiding. I said calmly. I was waiting. For what? For inclusion. That word lingered between us. The consequences weren't financial alone. They were relational. Claire had believed she could manage both sides, support her brother's ambition, and smooth over my hesitation later. Instead, she was now standing between two realities. A brother whose plan had stalled. A husband who had not reacted but had prepared. And preparation changes power dynamics. At a family dinner that weekend, the atmosphere was noticeably different. Daniel was polite, but subdued. Conversations about investments were replaced with safer topics. Her father asked casually, "What happened with that property idea?" Daniel shrugged. "Didn't line up. No one looked at me, but everyone knew. Not the details, just the outcome. The assumption that I would sign had evaporated. Back at home that night, Claire sat beside me on the couch, quieter than usual. "I didn't think you'd feel excluded," she admitted softly. "I wasn't feeling—" I said, "I was observing." She turned toward me. "That's worse." Maybe it was. Because emotion can be argued with. Observation cannot. The house was intact. The title secured. The equity is untouched. But something else had begun. The quiet understanding that I was not infrastructure. I was agency. And agency, once demonstrated, cannot be unseen. The consequences weren't loud. They were psychological. Daniel had lost momentum. Claire had lost certainty. And I had gained something neither of them expected. Redefinition. The panic didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in. 3 days after the lender formally declined the restructuring request, Claire came home earlier than usual. Her movements were tighter, not frantic, contained. "Daniel's investor pulled out," she said without preamble. I looked up from my desk. "Because of the title issue." She nodded. "They said the structure looked unstable without guaranteed equity transfer." Unstable. The word echoed softly. For weeks, they had framed the plan as low risk, clean, optimized. Now the same structure was being described as unstable. I didn't comment on the irony. Instead, I asked, was the investor aware that consent hadn't been secured? Her silence answered before her words did. "They assumed," she said carefully, "that it was a formality." Of course they did. Because I had always been treated as procedural, predictable, a signature waiting at the bottom of the page. Claire sat across from me, hands folded tightly. "He's really stressed," she added. "I imagine he is—" There was no satisfaction in my voice. Stress is what happens when optimism meets structure. That night, Daniel called me directly for the first time since the meeting. "Can we talk?" he asked. We met at a quiet cafe near Green Lake. No hostility, no raised voices. He looked tired. "You could have handled that differently," he said. How I asked calmly, "You blindsided us. I didn't sign anything." I replied, "That's not a blindside. That's a boundary." He exhaled sharply. "You knew how much was riding on this." "Yes," I said evenly. "And that's precisely why I reinforced protections." He leaned back, frustration simmering under restraint. "You made me look unreliable." I held his gaze. "No." I said, "The structure did—" There it was. The realization neither of them had anticipated. The plan hadn't failed because I attacked it. It failed because it depended on an assumption instead of consent. And assumptions don't hold weight in legal frameworks. Back at home, Claire was restless. "We could still fix this," she said one evening. "Maybe restructure differently. Maybe if you just what I asked gently." She hesitated. "Sign, with conditions." I studied her face. For the first time, I saw not confidence but urgency. "Claire," I said quietly, "if the success of a plan depends on pressure applied after the fact, it's not stable." Her eyes softened, but the tension remained. "You've changed," she said. "No," I replied. "You just saw a side of me you hadn't needed before." That was the part she struggled with. The idea that I had not transformed overnight into someone harder. I had simply stopped being assumed. Over the next week, Daniel's calls to her became more strained. Shorter, less strategic, more reactive. The opportunity window closed. Investors moved on. The duplex was sold to another buyer, and slowly, the realization settled in. There would be no quick recovery, no last-minute save. Because once lenders mark a structure as unstable, momentum dies quietly. And in quiet failures, there is no dramatic villain to blame, just a miscalculation. By the time Claire fully understood that the plan was irretrievable, something else had already solidified. Not anger, distance. Not emotional distance, structural distance. She had tested a boundary she didn't believe existed, and discovered it had been reinforced long before she looked for it. Too late to fix the deal. And perhaps, too late to pretend nothing had shifted between us. The real confrontation didn't happen at the dining table. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. No papers, no folders, no Daniel. Just Claire and me sitting across from each other with coffee growing cold between us. She had been quieter all week, less defensive, less certain. "I need to understand something," she said finally. I nodded. "Why didn't you just tell me you knew?" "Because I wanted to see whether you would—" I answered. She absorbed that slowly. "You think I was hiding it?" "I think—" I said carefully. You were planning to present it when it felt irreversible. Her jaw tightened slightly. Not in anger recognition. That's not fair. Isn't it? Silence. The kind that doesn't escalate. The kind that reveals. I thought, she admitted, if everything was clean and structured, you'd see the logic. And if I didn't, she hesitated. I thought you'd eventually come around. There it was again. Predictability, not trust. Expectation. I leaned back slightly. Claire, you didn't consult me. You advanced. There's a difference. She looked down at her hands. I didn't think you'd react well. I didn't react at all. I said, that's what scares me. That was the first honest sentence of the morning. Emotion can be negotiated. Anger can be argued with. Silence that contains preparation cannot. I wasn't trying to control you, she added softly. I know, I replied, and I wasn't trying to steal anything. I know that too. She looked up, surprised. Then what is this about? Respect, I said simply. The word landed heavier than any accusation. Respect isn't just about tone. I continued, it's about sequence. You don't move assets and invite your partner in later. Her eyes shimmered slightly, not with tears, but with the weight of understanding. I thought I was helping Daniel. She said, you were. I agreed, but you treated me like a resource instead of a partner. That was the line neither of us could avoid. She sat quietly for a long moment. I didn't realize I was doing that. I know. That's what made it harder. There was no villain here, no dramatic betrayal, just erosion born from an assumption. She reached for my hand. I don't want this to become something permanent between us. It already has, I said gently. But permanent doesn't mean destructive. She studied me. You're different. No, I replied calmly. You just see the full version now. The confrontation ended without raised voices. No ultimatums. No threats. Just clarity. For the first time, she understood something essential. I had not blocked her out of fear. I had not resisted out of pride. I had acted out of responsibility. And responsibility doesn't negotiate with pressure. It protects first. Everything else comes after. It's strange how quickly identity can shift without you moving at all. After that Sunday morning, nothing outwardly dramatic happened. We didn't separate. We didn't sell the house. We didn't make grand declarations about rebuilding trust. Life continued. But the dynamic changed. Claire began asking before assuming, not in a performative way, in a measured way. Can we review this together became more common than Daniel thinks we should. Small shifts, but structural ones. Daniel kept his distance for a while. When we eventually spoke again, it was restrained, polite, less visionary. He had recalibrated too, not because I humiliated him, because the framework had held, and frameworks don't argue. They simply stand. For my part, I didn't become colder. I didn't become suspicious of every conversation. I didn't weaponize what had happened. That would have been ego, not strength. Instead, I did something simpler. I stopped volunteering invisibility. When Claire and I discussed finances, I spoke earlier in the process. Not to dominate, but to establish presence. When extended family conversations turned toward speculative ideas, I didn't wait to be asked for technical validation. I offered perspective as direction, not commentary. The difference was subtle but felt. I wasn't infrastructure anymore. I was a decision maker. And the interesting thing about quiet dominance is that once demonstrated, it rarely needs repeating. I also looked inward. For years, I had equated peace with restraint. I believed that minimizing friction was the same as preserving stability. But I learned something critical. Stability without agency becomes containment. I had allowed myself to be the reliable constant while others experimented around me. That wasn't generosity. It was an abdication of visibility. Now, I am still calm, still methodical, still the man who reads every clause. But I am no longer assumed. Claire once said, weeks later, I think I misunderstood your question. How I asked. I thought it meant you'd always bend. I smiled slightly. Quiet doesn't bend, I said. It decides when to move. There's no bitterness in me, no resentment. What happened didn't destroy my marriage. It clarified it. It revealed where assumptions had grown unchecked and where I had allowed them to. The house still stands. The title remains intact. The equity is untouched. But more importantly, the foundation between us is no longer built on predictability. It's built on awareness. I am still Galvin Finn, 38, calm, measured, but now, unmistakably present. If you've listened this far, you might be waiting for a dramatic conclusion. There isn't one. No slammed doors, no legal battles, no public humiliation, just a quiet correction. My wife tried to transfer the house to her brother. I had the title secured. Her surprise move failed because I'd already anticipated it. But the real story was never about the house. It was about an assumption, about how easy it is to mistake calm for compliance, how easy it is to treat the steady person in the room as background infrastructure, how easy it is to move forward, believing someone will always adjust later. Quiet people are often misunderstood. We don't argue first. We don't announce every boundary. We don't compete for dominance in a room. But that doesn't mean we lack it. Sometimes dominance is simply preparation. Sometimes strength is reinforcing a foundation before anyone notices it's being tested. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is refusing to interrupt someone else's miscalculation. I didn't win anything. I didn't defeat anyone. I clarified my position. And clarity has a way of reshaping relationships without raising its voice. If there's a lesson here, it's this: don't assume the quiet person isn't paying attention. And if you are the quiet person, make sure your silence is chosen, not assigned. Now I'm curious. Have you ever been underestimated because you were calm? And when you finally moved, did they see it coming? I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments.